Welcome to the Pod-Key summary of Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War gets described with a lot of labels, and honestly, that's part of the story. It was a military uprising that became a civil war, a social revolution unfolding inside that war, and a heavily internationalized conflict that much of Europe pretended to stay out of while meddling constantly. It also left behind one of the most contested memories in modern history. Who was fighting for what? How violence should be understood, and why the aftermath lasted so much longer than the official end date. One reason this conflict still feels so slippery is that it really did mean different things to different people at the time. Some saw class war. Some saw religion. Some saw a struggle over regional identity. Some saw democracy against dictatorship. And many came to see fascism against communism. Those meanings overlapped, and they also fed fear. On the right, there was a growing conviction that revolution and state collapse were already happening. On parts of the left, there was a matching belief that parliamentary democracy couldn't actually protect them from fascism. So by 1936, both sides increasingly treated a military showdown as not just possible, but almost unavoidable, which is usually a terrible sign for a country. The July 1936 coup wasn't a neat takeover. It failed in a lot of major cities. And that failure is what turned the uprising into a long civil war. In places like Madrid, Barcelona, and Valencia, the government handed out weapons to workers, and that helped defeat the rebels in those industrial centers. But that same decision had a second effect. Once armed, anarchist and revolutionary militias didn't just defend the republic, they also started building their own power on the ground. So the republic was trying to survive a military revolt while also dealing with parallel authorities inside its own zone. From the start, the war came with a built-in argument about who was actually in charge. In Republican-held parts of Aragon, Catalonia, and elsewhere, workers and peasants collectivized farms, reorganized factories, and governed through local committees. This wasn't only emergency improvisation. It was a real social revolution happening alongside the war effort. The problem was that the anti-nationalist camp was politically crowded and deeply divided. CNT-FAI anarchists, socialist groups tied to the UGT and PSOE, the anti-Stalinist POUM, Republican moderates, and Soviet-aligned communists all had different ideas about how to win and what victory should even look like. Some wanted local autonomy and workers' control to stay at the center. Others argued that without a more centralized state and disciplined military command, the republic would lose. That contradiction blew up in the May days of 1937 in Barcelona, when Republican factions fought each other over strategic sites. After that, the communist-backed government moved against POUM and cut back anarchist power, which made the internal struggle brutally clear. The Republic wasn't only fighting Franco, it was also fighting over its own future society. On the nationalist side, unity was also less natural than it could look in hindsight. The coalition included phalangists, monarchists, Carlists, conservatives, Catholics, and military officers who did not arrive with one shared blueprint. Franco's political talent was turning that unstable mix into a centralized system under himself. He unified right-wing movements into Fête de las Honnes, absorbed phalangist symbolism, and sidelined or suppressed the parts of phalangism that might challenge his authority. He could present himself as heir to José Antonio Primo de Rivera while making sure the party answered to him, not the other way around. Nationalist success also depended on something less dramatic but very important: disciplined control in the rear, conscription, and the ability to use each territorial gain efficiently. The Republicans spent at comparable overall wartime levels, but isolation abroad, weaker access to arms, and shrinking territory made their resources much harder to turn into battlefield results. This war was international almost from the beginning, just under the polite fiction of neutrality. Britain, France, and the United States backed non-intervention, while Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union ignored the embargo and supported their preferred side. Italy sent roughly 70,000 to 75,000 troops. Germany sent about 16,000 personnel at peak levels. And the Condor Legion, the Soviet Union sent thousands of technicians and advisors, plus hundreds of aircraft, tanks, and artillery pieces. That turned Spain into a testing ground for modern air power, armor, logistics, and propaganda. It was a rehearsal space for a much bigger European disaster that was coming into view. The international brigades brought about 32,000 foreign volunteers to the Republican side, including the Abraham Lincoln Battalion and the Canadian Mackenzie Papineau Battalion. Militarily, they mattered less than full-scale state intervention. Symbolically, they mattered enormously. Spain became a global anti-fascist, cause people were willing to cross borders for. The bombing of Guernica on April 26, 1937, became the defining image of the war. Aircraft from the German Condor Legion destroyed much of the town and killed perhaps 200 to 300 people, and the international impact was much bigger than the immediate military value. Italian and German aircraft also repeatedly bombed Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, Durango, and other Republican areas. These raids weren't only about hitting targets, they were also about terrorizing civilians and showing that resistance would carry a price far beyond the front line. Then culture locked the image in place. Picasso's Guernica, along with journalism, photography, literature, and film, made Spain a worldwide moral symbol. George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, the work of Ernest Hemingway, Lillian Hellman, and Robert Capa, all helped turn the conflict into one of the 1930s central artistic and political reference points. The violence was vast, and arguments about it have never really stopped. Both sides carried out executions, massacres, religious violence, and political persecution, but historians strongly disagree over how to interpret the patterns and scale. Some emphasize breakdown and local revolutionary chaos in Republican areas. Others stress more organized left-wing violence. Debate is just as intense over the character and extent of nationalist repression. What is clear is that nationalist forces pursued what they called limpieza, or cleansing, in conquered territory. Trade unionists, teachers, political opponents, regional nationalists, suspected Popular Front voters, and even officers who refused the uprising could all be targeted. Estimates of nationalist executions during and immediately after the war range widely, from roughly 100,000 to 200,000 or more, depending on what years are counted. Even the total death toll remains disputed, because different estimates include different things: combat, executions, bombing, disease, malnutrition, post-war repression, exile, and lost births. That's why scholarly estimates run from around 250,000 to over 1 million, and why the familiar line of 1 million dead also became part of Francoist political memory. Militarily, the Republican position became basically irreversible after the nationalists split Republican territory in two in April 1938 and then captured Catalonia. The Munich Agreement crushed what remained of Republican hopes that Britain and France might finally join a broader anti-fascist front. Even near the end, the Republic kept fracturing. In March 1939, Colonel Segismundo Casado staged a coup against Juan Negrin, arguing the communists had become too dominant and seeking a negotiated settlement. Franco refused anything short of unconditional surrender. And even after April 1, 1939, the war didn't really end in human terms. It continued through executions, prisons, forced labor, exile, and guerrilla resistance. Around 500,000 Republicans fled to France in 1939. Thousands later died in Nazi camps, and anti-Franco guerrillas remained active into the 1950s. So when people argue over what the Spanish Civil War was, the uncomfortable answer is that it was several things at once, and the overlap is exactly what made it so destructive. It was a war over power, over society, over memory, and over who got to define Spain after the shooting stopped, which in many ways took a very long time. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.